So I've wanted to be a teacher for a long time, long before I knew anything about teaching or myself for that matter. But I can recall coming home from a long day of third grade, lining all of my stuffed animals up against the wall and announcing, "Class is now in session." Of course, to this day, my stuffed animals remain the most compliant students that I've ever had. Not once did I ever have to remind them to stay in their seats or to stop talking while I'm talking. But by the time I got to college, I realized that there was a pretty big difference between teaching my stuffed animals and a class of living, breathing students whose respect I would have to earn. And it was that fact alone that had me convinced for a while that I was going to struggle with teaching, struggle hard. You see, I knew that I loved English literature, and I knew that I was good at it even, but I couldn't imagine a world in which I would ever feel comfortable standing in front of a room of 30 students who may or may not be making fun of me behind my back. I remember the first thing that I taught this semester, and it was actually borrowed from a mini lesson that I heard back in 2015 when I attended GHP, aka Nerd Camp. I was so taken by this lesson as soon as I heard it that I scrawled it in the margins of my notebook and promised to somehow, someday, teach it to my future students. It was a mini lesson over the hero's journey and took stories from Star Wars, Harry Potter, and The Lord of the Rings and applied them all to Carl Jung's theories. In hindsight, maybe this was nothing special or inventive, but at 17 years old, this lesson ignited a passion for teaching English within me that has burned brightly ever since. So you can only imagine how I felt 4 years later when I was gearing up to teach my first real lesson to real students with real opinions. And it was that lesson, the one that inspired me so many years ago, and to me it seemed perfectly fitting. So I remember pulling up my trusty visual aid, tentatively walking to the front of the classroom, and my anxiety subsided in a way that I couldn't have predicted. I remember talking in my Flipgrid videos about how when I saw my students' faces light up at the mention of their favorite childhood stories, I became excited and my worries seemed to melt away. So that day that I talked about the hero's journey as if it was the most important thing on earth, I learned a crucial lesson, and that's that passion is essential. This I believe about the teaching of English. I believe that literature is the most important subject that our students take in school. Not because they have to know anything particular about literary devices, and not because they have to know how to properly employ a semicolon, and certainly not because it's going to make them rich and famous one day, but because literature is the one subject where students can study what it means to be a human being. So when we read lit, I believe that we should be teaching our students about the human condition. As Garrison Keillor writes in the introduction of Good Poems for Hard Times, the common life is precarious, and I believe that through literature, we are given tools to deal with this most precarious existence. So I believe that our English classes should be doing more than simply reading a text and answering some questions about it, and I know that nobody here would ever dispute me on that. And I'm certainly not saying that it's easy to avoid that trap. In fact, I learned firsthand how difficult it can be to come up with engaging lessons and meaningful assessments when I taught my first unit a couple of weeks ago. I created a unit based off of The Great Gatsby, and when I reread the great American novel, I read it like never before, and it dazzled me in a completely new way. You see, in the past, I had always read it with this literary critic's eye that I'd spent the better part of the past decade developing. But this time I read it from a teacher's perspective, with actual students in mind. See, I can proclaim from the mountaintops all day long that Gatsby is great, but I understand that my students might not think so, at least initially. So I scoured the pages of Gatsby, looking for parts that might be difficult or boring or confusing for any reason, and I started devising ways to jazz it up, pun intended. Of course, there were certainly failures within my unit. One such mistake was in this packet of mini body biographies. For some reason, I thought that my students would enjoy sketching out each of the 7 main characters and updating a list of traits after every chapter we read. But by the second week, I realized that this was more annoying than it was helpful, so I started to dial back on that a little bit. Of course, I also did have some successes in my unit. For example, the summative assessment for this unit was a theme multi-genre project. in which students were to select one out of these themes about the novel and complete 5 choice assignments related to this theme. This was a project that really emphasized student choice and creativity. And although I was initially met with resistance from some students, most students ultimately created work that they could be proud of. Some students certainly would have preferred a multiple choice test, which requires less work and less passion, but that would have been a disservice to my students and to Gatsby, which I believe is a book that matters, and I needed my assessment to reflect that. So when I go home today, I will be curling up with the 52 projects that were turned into me on Friday. And I will find the greatest joy in providing copious feedback to what they've created, because I asked them to make something important, so it's the least that I can do to provide good feedback in return. So moving forward, I want to expand upon what I did this semester, but make things more meaningful and engaging. Moreover, I'd like to revamp the way that my students view literature. I want them to understand that literature is something with real value, that literature will set them free, allow them to cross physical borders, meet new people, have new experiences, and ultimately learn more about life. So maybe this is an ambitious expectation to get my students to believe this way, but I believe that this is the best way to attack the subject with my students. So I initially became interested in the field of education because of my passion for literature, but along the way I've developed a similar passion for teaching high schoolers. My students need literature because I believe that it will remind them that they're not alone in their struggles. And my students, precariously suspended somewhere between childhood and adulthood, need this lesson more than anything.